Welcome to the Audio-Visual Knowledge Bank on E-Invoicing System of National Informatics Center, the first IRP. As per the decision of GST Council, registration of invoices is going to be mandatory for businesses with turnover above certain limits in the previous financial year. NIC as IRP has set up the ecosystem where the eligible taxpayers will be able to register the invoice, cancel the invoice, generate e-way bill while registering the invoice, generate e-way bill based on the invoice reference number, etc. These operations can be carried out through one of many modes such as through bulk registration using offline tool, API integration, mobile application, etc. In this video, we will introduce how the ERPs and the financial accounting systems can be integrated with NIC IRP through APIs. We will cover the concepts, the benefits of integrating the two systems using APIs, the process of registration for accessing and testing the APIs on the Sandbox environment, API documentation, etc. The website einv-apisandbox.nic.in provides all the essential information a developer needs to integrate the e-invoicing operations exposed by NIC IRP through APIs with their respective ERPs and financial accounting systems. The home page is accessible from anywhere without any login and provides various information. Let us visit the page Introduction. In this page, one can see the purpose of this portal, which includes the registration by eligible taxpayer to test the APIs in the Sandbox environment, the technical documentation on each of the API that is exposed for consumption, and a web-based test environment where one can understand the details of the steps involved in consuming the APIs. This tool will help the developer to understand the concepts and steps before actually starting to write the code to implement with their application. Now let us see the API overview. The APIs that receive the data for addition or updation use the HTTP post method, and those which provide data based on certain inputs use GET method. The APIs can be accessed only after a successful authentication. The data that is exchanged between the two systems is always encrypted, and RESTful APIs are exposed over SSL. The eligible API user has to complete a self-registration process using which the required credentials such as client ID, client secret, user ID, and password can be obtained. Using these credentials, one has to call the authentication API to get authenticated with the NIC's e-invoicing API system. On successful authentication, an authentication token and session encryption key SEK will be generated by the system and provided to the user. These two will be valid for 1 hour on the Sandbox environment and for 6 hours in the production environment. The subsequent calls to the other APIs will be trusted based on the auth token passed as part of the request header, and the request and response payloads would be encrypted using the SEK. Even if the auth API is called, while the previously obtained auth token is still valid, the same auth token and SEK would be returned and no new set is generated. For more details on the authentication process, please refer to the authentication API documentation, and on encryption and decryption of the payload may refer to the sample code provided and the other API documentation. There are multiple benefits of integrating the e-invoicing process with the existing ERP or financial accounting system. This will seamlessly integrate the two systems. Same data need not be entered into two systems. This will eliminate the data entry mistakes. This integration involves the e-way bill generation process as well. Some of the benefits are listed here, but there can be many more as per appropriate implementation strategies. There are other information provided through this website, like the onboarding process, where it is provided how to get the access to the production environment after completing the testing on Sandbox environment, how to create the credentials for accessing the APIs on the production environment as well as on the Sandbox environment, the best practices for integrating the ERPs and the financial systems with the E-Invoice system, and answers to frequently asked questions are available under the facts page, and we have release notes where the changes that have taken place since the earlier versions are listed for the benefit of the developers of API integration. Let us come back to the home page and explore what all information is directly available from the home page itself. The main section in the home page provides the API documentation for already available APIs in the e-invoicing API system. So the first and foremost is the authentication API, which is very important because unless we get authenticated with the e-invoicing system, we will not be able to use the other APIs. So once we have successfully authenticated, we should be able to generate the IRNs using the generate IRN API. Then we can cancel the IRNs using the cancel IRN API. We can get the details of already registered invoices using the get e-invoice details API. We will be able to generate e-way bills by referring to the IRN number by using the generate e-way bill by IRN API. And there is a provision to get the GSTIN details by passing the GSTIN using the get GSTIN details API. We also have a announcement section in the home page which will show the announcements that have been already made by the e-invoicing development team for the benefit of the application developers. And there are some resources provided like how the IRN is generated and the mapping of the attributes in the JSON schema as well as the schema published by the GSTN, and some master lists like the country master, currency master, port master, state master, etc. are provided, and some sample codes in Java and C# are provided for the benefit of the developers to refer to and develop the application in their own preferred programming language. Let us see the API documentation of some of the APIs. Let us first have a look at the authentication API. The overview section shows the purpose of the API, how the requests and the responses are exchanged between the taxpayer system and the IRP system are shown graphically. How to call the APIs is shown. The attributes to be sent in the request header are shown. The attributes of the request JSON that is sent as part of the payload is shown. Here, the password and the app key are encrypted using the public key provided by the IRP. The app key is a random 32-byte array generated by the client for every auth API call. This will be used to encrypt the session encryption key SEK that is sent by the IRP in the response using the symmetric algorithm. The response payload details are provided for successful as well as unsuccessful API calls. The SEK in the response, as mentioned earlier, is encrypted using the app key which is generated by the client application. So on receipt of this encrypted SEK, the client application has to decrypt the SEK and keep it for further encryption of the payload in subsequent APIs. The sample JSON for the request payload and the sample JSON of the response payload are shown over here, and the JSON response in case of error is shown over here, and frequently asked questions on this API are put at the bottom. Now let us see the generation IRN API documentation. This API is for registering the invoice or generation of the invoice reference number IRN. The image shows how the request header, request payload, and the response payload are exchanged between the taxpayer system and the IRP system. The request header attributes are explained. Auth token is obtained after a successful authentication call and is valid for 1 hour on Sandbox and 6 hours on the production environment. Request payload contains a JSON with an attribute by name data. The value of this data attribute is the encrypted generated IRN JSON. The response JSON attributes are explained in case of success as well as failure. The sample request payload in the form of JSON is shown. The request payload as encrypted is shown over here, and below that in the plain text form is being shown. The encrypted response payload is shown in the next box. Below that is the payload after decrypting using the SEK with symmetric algorithm. The decrypted JSON contains the IRN details, signed invoice, and signed QR code. Then the sample JSON in case of unsuccessful call is shown. The schema of the request JSON payload is shown over here. Then comes the validation section. Here the validations the API consumer has to consider while developing the consuming application. Similar approach is followed in other APIs that use the HTTP post method, such as cancel IRN, generate e-bill using IRN, etc. Only the difference would be in the request and response JSON payloads and the respective URL. Let us see the get E-Invoice detail API that uses HTTP GET method. The IRN for which the details are required needs to be passed as a value to IRN attribute as shown in the API URL. The request header would contain the attributes as in the case of POST APIs. The response JSON is encrypted using the SEK. On decrypting the encrypted payload, the JSON in plain text will be as shown. The decrypted JSON contains the acknowledgement number, acknowledgement date, IRN number, signed invoice, and signed QR code. Similar approach is followed in other GET APIs. The endpoint, the parameters passed in the URL, the response payload differ. The eligible taxpayers or the GSPs can register to get the credentials for testing the APIs in the sandbox. So the taxpayers can enter the GSTIN, then automatically it will show the trade name. Then the user is supposed to enter the mobile number and email address which are registered with GSTN, and then enter the CAPTCHA and click on validate button. So this will validate the registered mobile number and email against the database, and if they are correct, Then the user has to click on send OTP, which will send the OTP onto the mobile number. Now the user has to enter the received OTP and then click on submit. So now the user is prompted to create the user ID and password to access the APIs. The registration process will be similar for the GSPs. Only difference would be they will be selecting the radio button GSP and entering their PAN number. A virtual GSTIN would be created using which the registration process can be completed. After the entry of user ID and password, automatically the client secret and client ID will be created by the system and the same would be sent to the registered mobile number as an SMS. This completes the registration process. Now, one can use the credentials and go to the login page and try to log in into the system to verify whether the created credentials are working fine. And after logging into the system, they will be able to get the other details that are required for a developer to integrate their system using the APIs.